Were you talking about family, Dad said? Something about family history?
Well, that's one good topic, yeah.
Okay. What were you saying?
I started off with a little story about John Houseman in some movie where he was playing an aged director of the CIA or something. And the young fella came in and said something like, "Gee, you fellas must have had a wonderful time. I bet you, in the old days, I bet you really miss it, of the old days of the Cold War." And John Houseman said, "No, I don't miss that. What I miss is that kind of clarity."
Yep.
And that got us started about talking about Granddaddy and Uncle Vernon. One of the things that you definitely had in both cases was that kind of clarity. I didn't agree with much of what they did, but they had true integrity, that you always knew what you were dealing with, and you could count on certain behavior on their part, good or bad.
And what did you think was good about their behavior? And what did you think was bad about their behavior?
Well, of course, let's start off with Granddaddy, which was very, very good indeed.
Think
But
blows
your
over.
question was, how do you know what you could count on?
Right.
And,
What did you think was good and what did you think was bad?
well, one of the things that I think both of us thought was good, and that was Granddaddy's, the time he was on the board of the First Security State Bank
That is
of Charleston, Missouri.
And what was that? What happened? When was it?
They had, it was during the Depression, and there was, their bank, the board of directors met, and the bank had failed. There was no doubt it had failed. Outside the bank, there on Main Street in Charleston, there was a crowd. They wanted to get their money out. And when the board of directors, Granddaddy Gooden being a director, when they finished their meeting, all the other directors went out the back door. Granddaddy went out the front door into the crowd.
Well, there's a little more to that story, actually.
And
He had, prior to that time, he had put up everything he owned to cover the bank's debts.
And that's all his farmland and everything?
Everything, yeah,
How he made his living?
yeah,
His house?
yeah, everything.
Wow.
And they had this meeting and they decided they had a margin call
yeah,
and decided they had to put up whatever money they had to cover the debts owed to the depositors, which Granddaddy did forthwith.
And the other directors didn't?
Well, I think all of them did, more or less, or if they didn't, they'd have been sued, but they had to do it because they'd put, I don't know if all of the directors had signed on to pledge their property for the bank's solvency, but he did it. And when the day came, he put up his property, and they had a directors meeting declaring insolvency, I guess. And at the end of the meeting, they got up and got ready to leave. And as the story goes, all of them slunk away
except
through the
Granddaddy.
back door except Granddaddy, and he made the announcement, "I've lived my life so I can walk out the front door," which he did,
And which he had.
yeah.
And then what happened?
And then what happened?
He lost everything.
He lost
Everything he had was put up for sale
Sold on the courthouse.
on the
steps.
courthouse steps, everything, farmland and everything.
But what happened?
And he had a good buddy whose name was Bruton, owner of Bruton Snuff,
Snuff.
David
Now-
Bruton. But anyway, David Bruton had been a friend of my grandfather's, our grandfather, since childhood. And when they had this sale, David Bruton came to the sale and bought everything at public outcry that Granddaddy owned that was up for sale. and then immediately deeded it over to him and said, you can pay me back when you get around to it.
Wow.
Which he did.
Wow, which he did. The story goes he paid it back in 1 year, which was how valuable farming was in those days.
Or became very quickly, yeah.
Yeah.
Don't you wish bankers would do that nowadays?
Well, I wish lots of people would do lots of things nowadays that Granddaddy did routinely, but that's what I mean. I miss that kind of clarity.
Yeah.
So how are you different in the way you look at your relatives and the way Dad looks at his relatives? Same
You're
relatives.
talking about the same
Oh,
relative.
the same relative?
Same relatives.
Did you ever consider Daddy and me to be alike?
Oh, tremendously.
Tremendous.
Yeah, yeah.
Really?
There's a great resemblance between you and Uncle Vernon, your father, and the first A.B. Gooden, whose picture.
Hangs over the piano.
Yeah,
Is that right?
yeah. He looks like Uncle Vernon. I always said, boy, that's
With
just
a beard.
Uncle Vernon.
With a beard. Has
Yeah.
exactly the same nose.
Well, he
exactly
didn't
the same
have
mouth.
a beard in those days. I don't. Did he have a beard in that?
Yeah,
day?
in that picture, he has a beard and
I guess he
like
did.
this.
yeah.
Not here, but what do you call a beard with mustache? and
Goatee?
beard?
Goatee?
But it
Wasn't quite a goatee.
it was a full beard from here in.
Huh.
But I always thought Daddy could have posed that picture.
I
I mean,
did
the
too.
hair, the receding hairline, in exactly the same way.
I did too, and you looked a lot like Uncle Vernon.
So, all right, so how would you summarize how you think of the past relatives and their ability to have integrity and to stick to their principles and be very definite, as opposed to the way Dad thinks of them?
Well, I agree. I agree with Winnie-O. I mean, they certainly did. You knew where they stood. You didn't have to try to divine where they stood on things. They'd tell you, and they'd tell you the reasons. And it was like laying brick.
And it was an honor, a code of honor that
Exactly.
people had that was very strict, and people
Yep.
don't seem to even think about that anymore today.
Well, quite along those lines. I remember one time in Charleston, back when I was in high school or something, grandmother sent me down to the grocery store to get a little cash, which you had to do in those days, unless the bank was open, and gave me a check for something. $50, $100, something. There's a lot of money in those days.
Damn
But
right.
I took it in the grocery store, and this lady in the grocery store, some kind of a clerk, said, "Oh, I don't know. I'll have to check this." And she took it back to the manager, the lady who owned the grocery store. And she said, "Well, let me see the check." She said, "Oh," she said, "A.V. Gooden, that check's as good as gold. Go ahead, take it, pay
Oh,
it."
I didn't know that. You never
Oh, yeah,
told me that.
Yeah, yeah. That was typical.
Typical.
Yeah,
Exactly.
Yeah,
Word is your bond.
yeah.
and you were known by your family,
Mhm.
and you had a family honor to uphold yourself.
And felt that. I felt that.
Yeah.
And you felt
Oh,
that.
absolutely.
All our
Absolutely.
lives, you felt
Yeah.
that.
I think that's
Oh,
good for kids.
Grandmother used to say, "Oh, Winnie, you have a wonderful heritage." And Dad was standing there and he said, "Well, we like to think so anyway."
Oh, my.
So
Oh.
Lester, what do you remember about my granddad, Dad's dad?
I remember a very serious, when Uncle Win would look at you, it would be one of these looks like, and he would look at you very directly and speak to you very clearly and very directly, utterly devoid of chit chat, utterly devoid of chit chat, and he always seemed to take an interest in me, which was wonderful, which was so flattering, because, I'm talking about, I was 9, 10 years old when we went over to Tiptonville, and I walked through the door and he handed me the Scientific American. He said, "Here's an article I think you'll find interesting." Boy, did I try my best to read
Find
about
it interesting.
volcanoes or whatever it was, you know. And it was just so flattering to a little boy who, you know.
Well, you've got another story about Dad, my father, about the old man who he gave the stone to.
That
You need to
is,
tell that. That's
that
one of the
is
best.
Mr. Willie Rogers, Mr.
Yeah.
Willie.
And this illustrates the way the ex-cathedra manner in which Dad could put a point over.
Like nobody I've ever seen in my life. He could go to a meeting of philatelists or astrophysicists and be immediately accepted as not just one of their own, but one of the leading lights. I'm telling you, I just,
Yeah.
so,
In spite of the fact he didn't really trust Einstein.
despite the fact.
Yeah.
So there was a man who farmed in Charleston, an old man. He'd been there 25 or 30 years, Mr. Willie. But he had come from Tiptonville. And I was talking to him one day, and I said, while you were in Tiptonville, did you know Wynn, or you know my Uncle Wynn? Oh, Mr. Smith, I sure did. He said, I never forget. He said, it was the fall, and I was getting ready to move over to Charleston to farm Mr. Swain's land. And I was unloading grain, and something had happened to the pit there, and Mr. Smith was down in the pit trying to clean it out and working and just hot and sweaty. And he looked up and said, well, Mr. Rogers, I understand you're moving to Missouri to farm and Swain land. He said, yes, sir, Mr. Smith, I sure am. He says, well, I'm sure you'll do very well there. He said, and he looked down on the ground and picked up a rock, a stone, kind of a round, smooth stone. And he said, here. He said, keep this. He said, I'm sure you'll have good luck. And he said, you know what? He said, he was right. And I sure did. And I carried that stone. And he said, and he reached in his pocket. He says, and here it is. That was just amazing.
That was an eye-opener.
Wow. 25, 30 years later, still carried that stone in his pocket every day of his life.